Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
On today's episode, the final one of the year, we're talking about our favorite movies of 2020. Katie and I will run through our respective top 10 lists to see where we align and where we diverge on this unusual, unprecedented year for cinema.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, hello folks. Welcome again to Film Club. As we said, it is the final episode of the year. As we are recording this, we are both sort of on the... This time of year for us here at the AV Club is very hectic. It's the time of year where we're all trying to get together all of our best of materials, and I know that you and I, Katie, spend a lot of the last few weeks of the year doing this feverish catch-up, trying to see these movies that we have not seen throughout the year so that we can be more informed when we put together our best of list.
Right, absolutely. And, I think we talked about this a couple episodes ago, but, you have your personal goals for everything you want to see. Mm-hmm. And you just want to have the widest range of films possible for making a list, because if you've seen 20 films, your top 10 list is going to be more limited than if you've seen 150, right? Like, there's just more to choose from. You have a more solid opinion when you've seen more.
No, I mean, as you know, I actually have this kind of draconian...
I don't think it's draconian myself, but...
I basically have this standard that you have to reach if you're going to contribute to our list. And, I have a number of our contributors who write for the site over the year. It's mostly people who reviewed movies for the site over the year. I try to keep the people contributing to our annual best of list to people who are actually on the review beat for the AV Club all year long. Mm-hmm. But I basically am like, you need to kind of, and this is an honor system thing, I'm always like, you need to kind of hit this floor for the number of films you see. Most years it's 100 movies, which that might seem like a lot, but I'm always like, to really be able to assess and to vote on what the best movies of the year were, you need to have seen a fair number of them. Because, like you said, if you've seen 20 movies, I don't know if your top 10 out of that group is going to be very reflective, even of your own taste of what was the best movies of the year, Right,
exactly. I mean, you could watch, the 20 movies that you think are, like the most critically acclaimed of the year. Mm-hmm. But I think that is... I think you're going to end up with you're not going to end up with a lot of individual personality on your list.
It's going to be a very generic list if you do that. Yeah. It's just going to be everyone's favorites, sort of. So if you are listening and you don't know at this point, our list is up on the site now. It came out yesterday. That is our list of the 25 best films of 2020, voted on by about a dozen of us, actually, myself and Katie included. And you can check that out. You can also check out the individual ballots, which are linked to in the piece. That's a chance to kind of look at everybody's top 10 list, or top 15 list, actually, and see them. We did some writing on some superlatives. We talk about the most overrated movies of the year, the most underrated, that sort of thing. Really a chance to kind of see, to some extent, how the sausage gets made in putting together a top 25 list. Really atomizes it, where you can see everyone's taste. We're going to do something kind of similar here today on this final episode of Film Club. And that is Katie and I are going to go through our top 10s, our respective top 10s. And some of these are films we've talked about throughout the year, and some of them are movies that we haven't talked a ton about at all. And
not on the podcast, no. Yeah.
Right, yeah. We do have there's some overlap between our lists, and there is also some films that you and I sort of individually go to the mat for.
Absolutely, yeah. We overlap on exactly half of our top 10 lists. We had 5 films in common, and they are in different orders on our list. So
yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm not going to talk too much about. I think that we could potentially talk about what a strange year it's been for movies, but we've kind of been doing that all year long.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like every episode sometimes there's this. We kind of take a temperature check. We're like, yep, we're still in quarantine. There's movies are still not really in theaters, and we're still watching stuff at home. It's been a weird year for movies, but I said this in the intro for the best of Peace. I don't think it's been a bad year for movies, and I think it's actually been a really interesting one in some respects. And Katie, you have made this point before on the podcast when talking about the year in film, which is that maybe one of the reason we're seeing so much critical acclaim around some of these films is that there are movies that would normally get kind of lost in the shuffle of the award season conversation because of these bigger, splashier titles that have come out that the studios are pushing or the mini majors are pushing. And this year we've actually seen a lot of these movies that would be that might be reduced to footnotes in a quote unquote normal year actually become cornerstones of the conversation in film.
Yeah, and I think our top 10 list reflects that. And there's some interesting trends, along with these smaller films. We've talked about this on the podcast before, too, is that when you talk about gender disparity in terms of filmmaking and specifically with directors, a lot of times what happens is that the big blockbuster tentpole kind of films, the big budget films that haven't come out as much this year are overwhelmingly directed by men. And so you kind of see some smaller indie films, which are more likely to have female directors, getting more attention this year. And I think a side effect of that is that it's kind of elevated the status of women directors in the year-end conversation.
Absolutely, and I mean I think that's reflected on our own list. I mean, we 7 of the top 10 films on our collective top 25 list. 7 of the top 10 are directed by women, and I don't need to look to know that has definitely happened before.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever happened before. No way.
I do think it's interesting though, because I think that these are films that I think a lot of us would rank pretty highly in a quote unquote normal year as well.
Yeah.
I just think that they would also be competing against like a good example would be something like Wes Anderson's The French Dispatch,
right?
Which
or Edgar Wright's One Night in Soho was supposed to come out this year.
So, movies that the distributors of these films have decided that they would rather that they not release them to home viewing platforms.
Right.
That these are still theatrical releases and we're going to wait it out. And I mean, it does probably say something that a lot of the distributors of these films directed by women, decided that it's fine if they don't go to theaters.
There's a lot of there's a lot of stuff that, I feel that I understand it enough, kind of the economics of theatrical releases versus home video releases, but it's there's a lot to it, and probably more than we really need to get into on this podcast.
Yeah, I would agree. But so how about we get into our top 10s of the year? Mm-hmm. And we start talking. We're just going to go through them one by one and talk a little bit about them. Again, some of these films we've talked about before on the show, and some of them we haven't. So,
yeah.
I think that we should. I would say that we would start with your number 10, but I think that we should save your number 10 because
it'll come up later.
It's going to come up later. It's going to come up maybe much later at the end of this conversation. So let's put a pin on your number 10 of the year. And we'll go to mine, which is the Russian post-World War II drama Beanpole.
And actually, Ignati and I discussed this one back when Film Club was still a video, because we could film in person while you were at Sundance.
That's right. Yep. I'm actually a little jealous that I couldn't be part of that conversation. I'm a big fan of this film. I saw it at Cannes in 2019, which now feels like it was a million years ago. It was in the Cannes sidebar competition, Uncertain Regard, which is sort of like, these are the films that we like a lot, but they're not quite enough to be in competition.
Right.
So the film is directed by a young Russian director. His name is Kantemir Balagov, and he's become kind of he's like a darling of the festival circuit, and he is very young, damnably young. He is he's not even 30 yet, and I am blown away that somebody this young could make a film that it's not just extremely well crafted, but also I think pretty wise about the world and about disillusionment and about the complicated nature of some friendships. The film is set in Leningrad, like shortly after World War II. Obviously, a sort of a whole country, but also this whole city is going through post-traumatic stress, and we follow these two characters who were both in the war together, and they have this complicated friendship, one would say, and something happens very early in the film. A horrifying accident happens early in the film. I won't reveal it, even though it happens super early on, but something happens that that complicates their friendship further, I'll say. And
if you want to know what it is, it was one of our best scenes of the year, so you can look at that feature if you want to know.
That's true. You can look at that, and that will tell you exactly. That also it's also a really good sign. If you read about what happens early on and you think, wow, that sounds a little bit too much for me, this probably is not a movie for you. Because it's not like this gets less bleak as it goes on. But I don't think it quite... this is not a film that ever slips into misery porn. And
no, I don't think so either. Like, I wrote the review for this one, and I think I prefaced it, with this line about in a hospital where no one ever gets checked out, just describing this really bleak situation. And even before the scene that we're talking about, the film opens with the main character. She's called Beanpole because she's very, very tall and thin. It opens with a scene of like a bustling laundry in the hospital, and the main character just starts having a seizure in the middle of the laundry, and everyone keeps working.
Yeah, they're like, well, that's what she does, and that's kind of where everyone's at. Basically, everyone looks at her and goes, "Oh yeah, me too, same."
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and she's having a very dramatic seizure in the middle of the room, and everyone's like, yeah, Tuesday, that's what happens.
I think what I admire most about this film, honestly, is that all of the characters in this are kind of avatars for post-war Russia in a broader sense. I mean, we're talking about characters who are all sort of going through the process of rebuilding after the war and of processing the enormous amount of trauma that they all experienced. But our main characters, at least, never to me feel like they're symbols necessarily. I think this is a real relationship between two people, a complicated one. I mean, there are romantic undertones to it, but there's also competition and resentment in there, and I think this was one of the most fascinating relationships put on screen this year, and one that to me never felt schematic, even as the movie was clearly reaching for big insights about post-war Russia.
Yeah, I think this film is really good at letting subtext be subtext. Like you can read all the you were talking about into it, but it doesn't. It doesn't, like you said, it doesn't get to the point where it becomes this big, clunky, sort of, I don't know, like boulder you have to climb over to get to the narrative. Like, because the film, like, there's a lot of, like, beautiful color in it, and it's shot very beautifully, even in this bleak setting. And like you were saying, the director's very young, and I think that the wisdom you were talking about is he is really trying to express something about the Russian national character at that time, through the medium of these characters, but he's not being overly, I guess, dogmatic about it would be the word. He's not turning it into an academic thesis, which I admired as well.
Yeah, I mean, I never felt like the other thing is I never felt like I knew where this story necessarily was going. And for people like us who watch a lot of movies, it's really exciting to encounter a film that feels genuinely unpredictable. And I mean, my objection usually to what you could call misery porn, I think a lot of films get tagged as misery porn that aren't necessarily, but my objection to stuff that I think kind of genuinely fits that description is it often just sort of feels like a trudge to a foregone conclusion of misery, and I didn't feel that way with this one, even as, again, this is definitely a movie that steel yourself if you're going to watch this one, because this is a heavy film, no question.
Yeah, and the kind of films you're talking about where it's just a joyless slog, I think those kind of films give films like this a bad name.
Let's move on to your number 9, because we're gonna skip your 10 for now, and we'll come back to that later. But let's move on to your number 9. What do you got?
My number 9 is a movie called Bloody Nose, Empty Pockets, which is a really fascinating kind of experiment. So this is a really interesting film. It really sits sort of on the razor's edge between narrative and documentary. So it's a very loose narrative in the story. So the basic premise is that it's set in a dive bar that's supposed to be in Las Vegas called the Roaring Twenties, and it's the last day that this bar is supposed to be open, and it's just kind of a day in the life of the bar. So the way it was shot was that it is shot over 2 18-hour days in a dive bar, but it is not in Las Vegas. It's a New Orleans dive bar, and it is populated with actual kind of barflies, but they're not regulars of this particular bar where they shot it. The directors kind of went around New Orleans and cast colorful characters from around New Orleans who are, like I said, barflies, and kind of brought them all together into this bar and said, okay, the basic premise is this, and then just let the cameras roll over 2 full days, which would be 18 hours in the life of the bar, and said, you want to get sauced for free and be in a movie for a couple days? Is basically the sort of so they set up this sort of shadow area between reality and documentary where the premise is fictional but the interactions are not.
Yeah, I mean, I remember this bugged a few people when it premiered at Sundance. So there were those who thought that this didn't actually have any business being in the documentary program, because that's where it showed up at Sundance. And
I'm not sure I would call it a documentary. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right that it blurs those lines. But the thing is, I do wonder, though, honestly, if it really is all that relevant that this isn't a real bar, because ultimately it ends up feeling very much like a real bar. And at a certain point, if you got a group of people together in this public space and they're drinking and they're having conversations and these conversations are not scripted, at what point does a fake bar just become a real one?
Right, exactly. I mean, they did put them in a real bar and say, okay, let's get drunk. Yeah. And there's one character in the movie who basically lives at the bar, and that guy was there all day, both days. Yeah.
If you're talking about the character, I think you are. He's kind of the one ringer in the cast. Mm-hmm. One could say he's like I think he's been described as like at least a semi-professional actor. Mm-hmm. So he is like it makes sense that they bring in one person who's very, very well trained at improvising. Most of them are non-professionals in the sense that they really are just people who just barflies. Yeah. But he is somebody who has some acting experience. But I do think at a certain point he's drinking a lot too, and it feels at a certain point it really does capture the vibe of being at a bar. And
yeah, it does.
You could argue that because this isn't a real bar, because this is a simulated experience, that you sort of are seeing the last days of a bar. You're seeing the end of this particular public space that these people have gathered in. So you are sort of seeing the final days of a bar, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, but it's an artificial bar. Like, mm-hmm. It is the last day in the sense that the shoot was only 2 days. And on the second day, if there's this bonding that happens between strangers in a dive bar that I think this movie really captures, and probably by the second day everyone was feeling very sentimental, like, oh, my new buddy, totally. We're not doing this again. So it has that real vibe of it being the last day. It's just created through artificial circumstance.
Because people are getting genuinely quite wasted in this film. That's like quite obvious that. Yeah. In that respect, I mean, people have argued that an argument has been made that every film is, in a sense, a documentary because it's a document of its own creation. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I totally buy that.
This is a big example of that, though.
It really is. I mean, whatever the conditions that went into this, we are seeing a document of the creation of this film, in a sense. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. Yeah, it's a wonderfully funny film in the way that if you can tolerate... I think this is a film for people who feel nostalgia for bars, particularly this year, where you can't really go to one, if you can tolerate some first class drunk talk, because there's a lot of that in this, there's some big laughs in this film too.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a dive bar person, and so I just have so much affection for this kind of setting and these kinds of characters. And there's certain touches to it that are very authentic to that kind of bar life, the camaraderie that I was talking about. And also my favorite scene in the film is midway through, because it does go from like when the bar opens to last call is the sort of overarching structure of the film. There's part midway through in the afternoon where Jeopardy comes on and everybody sits and watches Jeopardy together and yells out all the answers on the screen. And I have some friends who are bartenders, and they are like, oh wow, yeah, we love Jeopardy, because that's when all the barflies shut up for half an hour. So just the fact that it has a Jeopardy scene in it is it's this wonderful little bittersweet ode to sort of life on the margins, I suppose.
We should mention, too, we've been meaning to do this, and I totally just forgot, but we would like to tell you where you can watch these films, too, if you're interested. Beanpole is currently available on many of the major digital platforms, your Amazons, your Google Plays, your Apple, etc. It is also streaming currently on Mubi, on the movie streaming site Mubi. So if you have a subscription there, you can watch Beanpole there. Bloody Nose Empty Pockets is also rentable through the various digital services.
Yeah, when we say something is available to rent digitally, we mean that it, between iTunes, Prime Video, YouTube, a few different platforms, you'll be able to find it to rent, depending on which kind of app you use on your TV. And a site that we use a lot, if you're not familiar with it, is called Just Watch. If you look up Just Watch, you can type in any movie and it can tell you where you can rent it.
Marvelously useful.
Very useful.
Resource, very useful for me too as editor, just being able to know exactly where to direct people if we're like working on like a watch this piece or something, to be like Just Watch has our back.
Yeah, I have the tab open permanently during the cramming season that we've been talking about.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so my number 9 film of the year is Vitalina Varela. And that is the latest film from Portuguese director Pedro Costa. And Costa is sort of, I think you could describe him as kind of an acquired taste. He makes, he's kind of a slow cinema master. And slow cinema, for those who have never heard that description before, is, sort of what it sounds like. Movies that unfold at a kind of, sometimes an agonizingly deliberate pace, often through very long takes.
Yeah.
There tend to be a certain amount of inactivity in them. They're not films where these are not films where something exciting is happening at every minute. They kind of slow your perception to the rhythms of a certain way of life sometimes. And that's very much the case. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm gonna be honest. This is a taste I have yet to acquire.
I have acquired it. I think. For the most part.
Yeah, you're a fan of this type of cinema. Yeah,
I am,
for sure.
Within reason. I mean, it's not like every time a filmmaker. There are times when I do feel like a filmmaker is just sort of wasting my time.
Where, I like slow. I don't mind slow films. I don't mind films where not a whole lot happens. But sometimes the slow cinema stuff, it does kind of feel like a dare, and I don't have a lot of patience for that.
Well, I think it could be an affectation, as with everything. These movies tend to do very well on the festival circuit, and they tend to be often very revered by sort of one could say sort of deep cinephiles, because there's a sort of purity to putting an audience through this kind of endurance test. But I don't think all of them. The intentions are good, and I don't think all of them do that for a reason. But some of them do, and I think this is one of them. And Costa's work has been. I have found it difficult sometimes to adjust to his rhythms as a filmmaker. All of his films, or almost all of them anyway, are set in Lisbon, and in this particular neighborhood of Lisbon, and they all kind of unfold in these sort of crumbling, decaying neighborhoods with long passageways where we're seeing these non-professional actors sort of stagger down these long passageways. It's very painterly. I heard somebody say that his work is sort of indebted visually to like biblical paintings, you know? And you can definitely see that. I mean, this is one of the most striking films of the year in terms of composition, in terms of its use of a kind of muted color scheme, and its use of shadows. But this is not a film, unlike some of Costa's past work, this is one that I think actually does have a really strong dramatic anchor. Mm-hmm. And it actually has something of a story, which not all of his films do. It basically concerns the title character, who is also played by a non-professional actor named Vitalina Varela. And she is this woman who has come to Lisbon to bury her husband, a husband who sort of decades earlier abandoned her, and left her alone out of the city, and said he would come back eventually, and never did. And she comes to Lisbon to bury him. She shows up too late. He's already dead. And the movie is sort of just about her getting his affairs in order, but also her grappling with this very intense commingling of feelings that she has about this man's death.
Right.
Genuine grief, but also resentment towards him, and regret about the years that she spent waiting for him to come back. And long stretches of the movie are just her face in close-up, and she has just this beautifully expressive face that says so much. I mean, like, this is a movie that's very much about landscapes in the architectural sense, but it's also about the landscape of someone's face, and maybe by extension the landscape of their soul.
That's something I in one of my films to talk about later that I felt it was so expressive.
See that, yeah. You always find these links when you do these exercises going through the films of the year. You see these conversations that are happening between the films by accident.
Yeah.
But she also has these moments where these kind of monologues she delivers to him, and you realize the film is at least partially about she came to not just say goodbye to him, but to say everything that she meant to say to him, but she can't now because he's gone.
Right.
It's just this beautiful, bittersweet. I mean, maybe just bitter, honestly, in some respects. But just this beautiful character study. And I do think that it requires a degree of patience. But if you're looking for an in into the films of this director, who is very revered in some cinephile circles, I think this one is about as accessible as his films get.
Well, let's go to my number 8 film, simply because it is the exact opposite. My number 8 film, this was like far and away my favorite genre movie of the year. I thought that this was just fantastic. I first saw it to go behind the curtain a little bit. I was working on a film festival that ended up kind of getting shuttered for obvious reasons, and so I saw this one a while ago, back in March, and I was just like, it is Possessor by Brandon Cronenberg, who is the son of David Cronenberg, that famous Canadian body horror auteur. And Brandon is following in his father's footsteps a bit, one could say. So this film, it's a body swap film, sort of akin to if you've seen The Cell. It's that kind of thing where people are running around in other people's minds, to put it very simplistically. It stars Andrea Riseborough, and she plays an assassin named Tasya Voss, who specializes in going inside other people's heads and sort of using them as puppets to carry out assassinations with it's the perfect crime. It doesn't leave any trace behind, because she just leaves their minds, and that's the end of it. And it opens with this is an extremely bloody, violent film. It was released in theaters as Possessor Uncut, and there is a cut version apparently on home video, which is why it was advertised as Possessor Uncut in theaters. Yeah, because we were wondering. The mystery is solved. yeah, finally figured out the mystery, because when it came out, we were like, why is it labeled uncut? It hasn't been released before. They did cut it for home video. So there's 2 versions on Blu-ray. And I think you should. I mean, if you're going to go for it, I think you should really go for it and watch the uncut version.
No, I mean, come on. Like, a version of this that's less violent is sort of beside the point, if you ask me.
It is kind of beside the point, yeah, because, like, this film is so bloody that it almost becomes, like, surreal or and he blends it with this, because of the sort of theme of going inside other people's minds. The main plot of the film is Tasia Voss, she takes an assignment, and she goes inside the head of Christopher Abbott, who is, he's the boyfriend of a sort of heiress to a big, what is it, like a tech corporation?
Yeah, it's like a big corp. They're like a, I think they're a data mining firm, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And so she goes inside of his head with the intention of carrying out a hit, but he becomes conscious that there is someone else inside his mind. And that goes in an extremely surreal, I would call it like harrowingly, pummelingly psychedelic, where it's psychedelic but not in a sit back and groovy way, but psychedelic in a way where it's an assault.
Trip.
Yeah, it's an assault on the senses. It's very intensely psychedelic, faces melting, minds shattering kind of stuff, combined with this very, very bloody to the point where you could classify this film as sci-fi or horror. Sort of assassin thriller, and I really liked it. It was my favorite genre movie of the year by a mile.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the opening scene, the scene where she goes and kills this person, and we sort of see her line of work and how she performs it. That opening scene reminded me a lot of the opening scene of Ghost in the Shell, the 1995 anime, and there's a lot of, I think, genre DNA from other movies in this film. I think that's kind of inherent to genre filmmaking, to be honest. For sure. But I think that Cronenberg, Brandon Cronenberg, the director of this film, I think he is drawing on a lot of influences in this case, and not just his father. But sort of churning them together into something that feels distinctive. If you and I disagree at all on this film, I think we do have one point of disagreement, on this film, which is that there's a part of me that wishes this movie, I feel at a certain point that there's so many sort of mind-bending cerebral ideas and so much potential in this particular premise and how it deals with identity and the idea of losing yours, that at times I felt like the violence was, that these kind of scenes of outrageous violence were distracting from that in a way. But I remember you saying to me,
I feel like the violence is the point, honestly. I feel that so sci-fi, like you said, is often a very detached, cerebral kind of genre. And what I liked about this one is that it is a purely visceral, it takes kind of abstract ideas and turns them into a purely visceral experience. And I found that very invigorating and exciting in terms of sci-fi, because it is so often coolly detached.
That is very Cronenberg too. I mean, that's very much in the family tradition, one could say. I will say too that this, I do think this has there's a really disquieting element to this movie as a character study, and I can't say too much more about that without ruining where it goes. But I do think this is a film about why somebody might choose this as their very strange, very, one would say, immoral line of work.
Yeah, why one might not want to be oneself for a while. Right. Yeah, that's another kind of theme that hangs in the film. But I feel that, having these themes sort of in the background of this really pulpy, bloody story, I think that it kind of opens it up for discussion and for further rewatches and that kind of thing. And it just adds texture to it. It makes it more than just a pure exercise in blood and gore, I think.
Okay, so that's Possessor, and Possessor can be rented or purchased digitally through the major services. And Vitalina Varela, I should mention too, you can watch that from home. It is actually currently streaming on the Criterion channel, if you have a subscription to that. And it is rentable through Apple. So if you have iTunes, you can rent it as well. So my number 8 film of the year is
this is a different type of sensual experience.
it very much is much less gross than Possessor. And
I like that kind of thing.
and also a film that has spark some debate as to what qualifies as a movie necessarily, and it is Steve McQueen's Lovers Rock.
Yeah.
Now, Lovers Rock is the second episode of McQueen's British anthology series, I guess you could call it, Small Axe, and we've talked about it a few times now on the show because it has inspired a lot of debate about how one might classify such a thing. I mean, it was developed as a miniseries for British television, and in fact played first on, I mean, it premiered at the New York Film Festival. 3 of the episodes did anyway. But in terms of commercial release, it began on the BBC, playing on TV on a week-by-week basis. On the other hand, all 5 of the installments in this series are feature-length. They are all effectively movies. We here at the AV Club kind of drew it, like, we sort of just decided on saying, screw it, they're movies and they're TV. So you will actually find this film, Lovers Rock, on our best movies of the year list. You will also find Small Axe as a whole on our television list.
Yeah,
that's right.
Which is also out.
That breaks my brain a little bit, and maybe it breaks yours too, but it actually makes sense, especially in this weird year. And honestly, any list, I think, of the best movies of the year that does not have Lovers Rock on it, well, I don't want to say everybody's different taste, but I would say that this movie very much belongs on this list. And
yeah,
I saw it at the New York Film Festival. I'm putting "at" in air quotes because obviously I was not anywhere near New York when I covered that film festival. I saw it for the virtual edition of the New York Film Festival, and all of the Small Axe installments are about sort of black British life over the period from the 60s to the 80s.
Specifically, like immigrants from the Caribbean. So, like Afro-Caribbean culture as it translates into life in Britain in the 70s and 80s, mostly.
Yep. So a highly specific milieu, and yet every episode of the series is different and is tonally different and looks at a sort of different corner of black British culture. And the second one, Lovers Rock, is in some respects it's kind of the loosest of the group. It's the one that feels the most it's kind of the closest that McQueen, a filmmaker who has made such films as 12 Years a Slave and Widows and Hunger, Shame is his other one. It kind of is a hangout movie. Honestly,
it absolutely is. I would call Lovers Rock, you mentioned slow cinema. I think Lovers Rock in some ways is pure cinema in the sense that it's about watching the imagery on the screen. It's about the combination of the music and the cinematography and the costuming and the choreography all coming together to create a sensual experience as much as it is about the plot of the movie, because the movie has very minimal plot.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically about a young woman who goes to this house party in the 1980s. There were these regular in London. There were these regular house parties that would play a mix of soul and reggae, and they became these spaces that Black Londoners could go to, and they would not be harassed by or harassed in the way that they were at some of the other clubs in London. They were welcome. Obviously, they were welcome there in a way that they were not welcome at all the clubs in London. And McQueen sort of envisions this house party and others like it, presumably, as this kind of sanctuary space where people could come and meet and dance and eat good food and drink, and away from the hostility of life outside of its walls.
Yeah, and it's not a completely idyllic space. There are some bad actors at the party, but overall it is a sanctuary, like you said. They've got this big door guy at the door who's making sure that it's a safe place inside to just enjoy yourself. And that's one of the things I did like about the movie is that, this woman's experience isn't horribly traumatic. She goes out to a party, right. She has a fun time, she meets a guy. It's the kind of night out that you might take for granted while it's happening, but then later on you would look back on it very fondly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, honestly, it reminds me a little bit of something of like a Richard Linklater movie. Because it's very much just sort of vibing with these characters. You know, I mean, this young woman goes to this party and meets a guy, so it becomes this kind of slim romance, but that doesn't end up consuming the whole film. Like, really, it is kind of just a portrait of this space, this particular space, and of this dance floor. And as somebody who very much misses public life and who very much misses, this may surprise some listeners, but misses going to the dance club. I mean, like Danny's here in Chicago. I don't know about you. I don't know if you ever went to Danny's here in Chicago.
Oh, recently. I've been to Danny's.
Yeah, this movie reminded me a lot of the experience of being at Danny's, where it's just it's kind of dark, and it's the space is very small, but the music is right, and you're having a good time, and the drinks are flowing. And Danny's, by the way, R.I.P. has closed. It's one of the many businesses in Chicago and elsewhere that has not survived the pandemic. Lovers Rock made me highly nostalgic for the experience of getting together with people and dancing and listening to music.
Yeah.
I mean, it is like there are a couple sequences. I mean, we called when the AV Club posted our list of the best scenes of the year. It was almost, once we decided that the Small Axe installments were eligible, there was almost no question that our number one choice of the year, our choice for scene of the year, was going to be a scene in Lovers Rock.
It really opened the floodgate, didn't it? Everyone was like, "Ooh, okay."
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there was no more transcendent scene in movies this year than this scene, and it's just basically the DJ puts on this Lovers Rock song from 1979 called "Silly Games," and it turns into this joyous group sing-along, and communal experience right now is something that we don't have access to, but Lovers Rock made me feel in touch with it in a way that I'm very grateful for.
Well, it's interesting, you know, the way that McQueen captures the sort of shifting tones of the party is through the music. And there's another dance scene later on in the film that I really liked a lot, too. The one you're talking about is mostly couples dancing together. But towards the end of the film, there's a later scene where it's mostly men on the dance floor dancing together and having this really, like, energetic, cathartic experience, you know, yelling out and pumping their fists. And I thought that was a really powerful scene as well.
Yep. Totally agree. I think ultimately what makes it a pretty wonderful film is that it's both highly specific. It's about this particular time, place, and milieu, but it also, there is a quality about it that feels universal too, at least in the sense that everybody wants to have a night like this. You know?
Yeah, and I used to throw a lot of parties in college, actually, and we would do stuff like this. And yeah, that's sort of the root of what I said about a night that you take for granted at the time, but later you think back on it.
Yep. Lovers Rock, by the way, is available to stream on Amazon Prime, as are all of the Small Axe episodes. Another good, the Red, White, and Blue, the episode that comes after Lovers Rock is quite good too, I think. But
yeah, and I liked Mangrove also. Mangrove is a fairly standard sort of courtroom drama, but I thought it was very well staged and had some good performances in it.
Yeah, also a good film.
Yeah, they're all worth watching, honestly.
Yeah, and actually, I believe as of this Friday, you can see all of them, because I think the last one actually hits Prime. The last one, which is called Education, hits Prime on Friday. So they are all available on Amazon Prime. Check them out.
Yeah, and they're all kind of in dialogue with one another. So as a whole, the whole thing is definitely worth watching. 5 films. Yeah, and they all sort of, like we were saying, represent different aspects of this particular experience. So let's move to another film that showed up on a lot of lists, I think, this year for the AV Club, which is First Cow by Kelly Reichardt. This film is, I would say, you said that Vitalina Varela is Pedro Costa's most accessible film to date. I think that First Cow is perhaps the most accessible Kelly Reichardt film to date. She's also known for not slow cinema. Like I don't know if I put.
I mean, like I think Meek's Cutoff qualifies. Honestly, yeah. I mean, I think somewhat. I mean, she's kind of on the line. I mean, her movies don't necessarily. She's not a filmmaker who is going to make you stare at one image for 10 minutes or something. But her movies are very meditatively paced.
And this one does open with a shot of a boat for a solid.
It does. I mean, the opening shot of this film is a boat crossing the frame, and it basically peeks into the frame from left, and then crosses it right. And I do feel like that is Rijkaard basically saying, "Hey guys, this is kind of what the pace of this movie is going to be to some extent." It's also I feel like this really powerfully symbolic image about the fact that we're going to be kind of seeing the flow of lives through history.
Yeah. I think that shot too is a very right, because then after that we go to there's a Aaliyah Shawkat appears in the film briefly at the beginning as just a woman walking her dog, and she's walking along this riverside riverbank where the boat is passing by, and then her dog smells something and runs into the woods, and she ends up finding two skeletons laying next to each other, buried in the woods. And so the film from there tells the story of those two skeletons when they were alive. So we go back to the Oregon frontier back in the 1820s, back when non-native people first started coming out to the Pacific Northwest, and it kind of revolves around two men. John Magaro, he stars as Cookie Figowitz, who he's kind of a man out of time. He was a very gentle person, put in this very rugged, violent sort of milieu. Yeah. He's a cook, he's a quiet, sensitive kind of guy. And he ends up striking up a friendship with another pioneer traveler named King Lu, who's played by Orion Lee, he's I'd say a more adventurous guy. He's been all over the world. He came originally from China, and now he's in the Oregon Territory, and they end up becoming close friends and start this business selling oily cakes, which basically fried donuts at the sort of what do you call it? I guess like a fort.
It's a fort. It's basically a fort in the Oregon Territory. It's like the closest thing they have to a town in this particular part of you can't even call it a state yet. I don't think it had achieved statehood at that point. So
yeah, and King Lu is he's got that entrepreneurial spirit that people say made America great, and so he says, hey, let's sell other kinds of let's sell all this stuff, and he says, well, I have this recipe, but I need milk, and there's only one cow in the territory, the first cow of the title, which we see arrive at the territory in another shot, kind of floating along a river on a raft, and we see the cow arriving. And so they start stealing milk. The cow belongs to the governor of the territory, and so they sneak in at night and steal the milk and just basically get successful selling these cakes. And it's kind of a story of their friendship. And similar to what we were talking about with Beanpole, I think this film has a lot to say about the American character and about, sort of the way that capitalism and competitive, competition have shaped the American character since this time. But it doesn't bonk you over the head with it, I don't think. And it's madcap at times, which is unusual for Kelly Reichardt.
I don't know if I would describe it as madcap, because that implies
they fall out of trees.
They do
scuttle around. And
I guess there's a slight madcap quality. Madcap. When I think of madcap, I think of something that's kind of moving at a particular speed, and that's not really Kelly Reichardt's thing. Her movies are all kind of
okay, fair.
Again, they sort of move not at a crawl, but they're definitely like we're going to attune you to a different way of life and to a different speed of life.
The speed of nature, I think, is how you can describe Kelly Reichardt movies. There's one kind of madcap scene. Let's say that.
Yeah. Okay. I described this movie recently as an iceberg because in some respects, not because it's cold and chilly at all, it's actually a very warm film, but because I think it on the surface, it is a very small story about these two men and a very affecting one. But then I think underneath the surface, there's this whole critique of America and this whole, as you said, this whole vision of the kind of spirit that shaped America. And I think it's very much, if you're feeling resentful towards capitalism, First Cow will gently affirm those feelings for you, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
But it doesn't push that really hard. It's never a screed. And I think the relationship between its wider historical, cultural, national vision and this very small, intimate, moving story about this friendship, I think that is the key to its power. I've like come up on this film a lot. Sometimes people ask, like, do you ever wish you could go back and change a review or give something a higher grade? Mm-hmm. I would bump this one up. I gave it a B+. I mean, I don't want to get too hung up on grades, but this is better than a B+. It definitely is. If
grades are difficult. They
are difficult, honestly. And the second viewing of it, which I did very recently, I agree with everything I wrote about it back in March when it was one of the last films to open in theaters. But to me, it feels like an even richer film on second viewing. We've talked a lot about it on this show. You and I did a whole episode of it for the video version of Film Club right before we had to stop doing the video version. And we talked about it at the half too. But I think there's a real reason that this film tops our collective list of the best movies of 2020. It's a hard film to dislike. Actually, I should say it's a hard film maybe for film critics to dislike anyway, because in renting it to rewatch it recently, I noticed that it has a 2.5 on Amazon, 2.5 out of 5 stars. Like, the fuck are you talking about? This
maybe is like too slow for people.
I guess so. It's such a wonderful. It's such a sweet, wonderful film that also I think has a really rich idea about this country.
Yeah, like you were saying about the iceberg thing, because on the surface, it's a sweet movie about kindness and tenderness and friendship, and the relationship between Cookie and King Lou is just it's so sweet. It's the opposite. If you're upset about toxic masculinity, Cookie and King Lou also will.
Yeah, this is non-toxic masculinity. It really is.
Oh,
it's just
absolutely. It truly is. Yeah, they're these rugged frontiermen who have a very sweet friendship.
I bring this up like every time we talk about the film, but I think that there's an early moment in the film that is so illustrative of who Cookie is as a character and what this movie is, the sort of tone of this movie. And the first moment we see him, he's walking through the woods and he comes across this lizard that's lying on its back in the woods, and he just kind of leans down and flips the lizard over. And it's just this, Reichardt is so good at those kind of little precise details of environment and character, and it says so much about him immediately, especially in contrast to the men that are around him. He's like, at the beginning of the film, Cookie is like traveling with a group of fur trappers, and they're all like basically like barbarians, and he comes across as like the most enlightened man in the old world, you know?
Yep.
So First Cow, again, we've talked about it a lot. If you'd like to hear more about it, you can queue up an old video episode of Film Club from March. We've also, obviously, there's the review on the site, and it is at the top of our list of the top 25 films of 2020. It was number 6 on your list. It is number 4 on mine. You can, if you'd like to see the film, it is available. You can rent it digitally from the major providers. I believe it is also showing on Showtime currently.
Yeah, it's on Showtime, and if you have Hulu, you can do the premium subscription and watch it through that platform.
Okay, that was so First Cow was actually your number 7 of the year. I said it was your number 6. That's wrong. If you would like to, again, the ballots are available on the website if you'd like to follow along with that, because we are apparently quite bad at keeping track of where we are, at least I am. So my number 7 of the year is a documentary called Time. And this film premiered at Sundance back in January. I actually saw it at the True False Film Festival a few short days before the whole world changed, or at least the whole country changed, and we all went into lockdown. It was basically the last trip I went on before all of this, you know?
I think it may have been the last in-person film festival in the U.S. this year.
That actually is probably true. I think it probably was. And I will say, too, that the virus was very much on everyone's mind there. I feel pretty grateful that I didn't get COVID being there. I think the spread was still happening at that point, but you could tell that attendance was a little lower, and you could tell that there was a general kind of, anytime somebody like sneezed in a screening, you could kind of see
every head turned.
Yeah, you could see like a collective wave of unease go through the whole auditorium, you know. So time follows this woman named Fox Rich, and in the 90s, her and her husband robbed a bank. They were sort of, it was sort of a time of they were trying to open a business, and they felt at the time that that their recourse, that they didn't have a lot of recourse economically, and
it was a desperate move. It was a desperate move on their part. Yeah,
it was a desperate move, and she got a couple years in prison, but her husband got a particularly, I used this word earlier, but a particularly draconian sentence, where her husband was basically sentenced to decades of time behind bars. And most of time concerns the years that followed. And Rich sort of, her full name, by the way, is Sybil Richardson, but she goes by Fox Rich. That's sort of the name that she adopted when she became an activist for prison reform. And so she became a small business owner, and she raised their children over the 20 years that followed, and spent a lot of her time basically advocating for prison reform in public spaces and giving speeches about it. And so the movie is partially about her campaign to get her husband Robert out of prison after. It was an armed robbery, but his sentence, which was something like 60 years, very unusual for.
It was one of those.
Crime.
It was political. It was one of those crime and punishment things where they were making an example of him to show that they were tough on crime, and of course, that kind of stuff is always racial.
Yep. Oh, for sure. So I think there's a version of this movie that you could see that is all about, that becomes a procedural about the campaign to get her to get Robert out of prison, basically. And we've seen versions of that over the years. We've seen something like the Paradise Lost films, which are all about the attempt to get the three kids in the West Memphis 3 case out of prison. But that's not really what Time ends up being.
I thought this is a beautifully edited film. I thought that the sort of the way that it weaves together past and present, and it really captures the sort of passage of time, and it brings the full weight of those decades apart. It really imparts that impactfully because of the way that it sort of ties all these different time periods together. Fox has a lot of home video that she shot to show her husband while he was in jail over decades, and it really creates this sort of feeling of like the river of time flowing and how it emotionally has affected their family.
Yeah, I mean, and that is the core of the film, really, honestly, because and it's my understanding that when the director, Garrett Bradley, who I believe this is her first documentary, she works mostly in narrative film, or did before this anyway, she originally intended this to just kind of be a documentary short about Rich's sort of day-to-day life. There's this running thread through the film where we sort of sit down with her as she makes phone calls to the courthouse. And that becomes this regular marker in her life, is that she's constantly making these phone calls and constantly working on the appeals process, and often getting stonewalled or just ignored by the people on the other end of the line. The movie originally was conceived as it was largely just going to be that. And then on the last day of shooting the documentary, her subject, Fox Rich, handed her this bag of tapes, basically, and said, by the way, for the last 20 years, I've been shooting home movies for my husband. I've been basically making a video diary to show him his children growing up.
Yeah.
And
BTW, here's my whole life.
Here's my whole life. I mean, it's something that a documentary filmmaker like prays for, that you get something like this, because we essentially get to see this family over the course of 20 years. It's almost like Boyhood in a sense, where you're seeing people grow up on screen because they filmed through the whole thing. But Bradley does not organize it chronologically. It's not like it's not like she starts in the 90s when his prison sentence began, and goes from there. The movie is constantly cutting back and forth and creating these kind of visual echoes between different moments in time. We'll see her children, when they were children, and then 1 second later she will cut to them as high school kids, and it really expresses the degree to which time has passed. And I just thought this was a beautiful film about the way that the title seems simple, but and obviously it's a bit of a pun as well. her husband is doing time, but it's also about the time.
The passage of time, yeah.
Yeah, but it really is rare to find a film, particularly a documentary, that can really convey that sense of the way that people have changed over the years and the toll that time takes on people.
Yeah, I was going to say, there is the sense of the title of Doing Time, and I think that the way that this movie shows the passage of time really hammers home the tragedy that this man wasn't there this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that his sentence is the family sentence as well. That they are serving their own sentence without him. There are some very heartbreaking moments in this film where it's just acknowledged that these kids have never known their father. And
I mean, they visited him, but they've never had a Christmas together or anything like that.
They've never had him in their home, essentially.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I love this movie, and I think it's the documentary of the year, honestly. Yeah, you can. This film is currently available on Amazon Prime, so you can watch it there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to skip past number 6 because your number 6 is Lovers Rock, which we already talked about. And my number 6 is a movie we are going to wait until the end to discuss, which I think you'll understand. But let us go to your number 5 film of the year. Yeah,
well, it's good timing, actually, because I thought this was the documentary of the year. It's a film called Collective. It's a Romanian documentary. So this film comes with the endorsement of a documentarian who I really respect, who is Joshua Oppenheimer, who made 2 films called The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, which I think are just, monumental pieces of work in that genre. And this is one that when you hear about it, you're like, oh, geez, that sounds so boring. So let me read you the tagline. Journalists uncover healthcare fraud in the wake of a deadly nightclub fire in Bucharest, Romania in 2015. It sounds like a snooze. But I found this film just incredibly compelling, just absorbing from the very beginning to the very end. So it does start with journalists at a sports magazine who are uncovering, they're trying to understand. So there was a big nightclub fire in Bucharest in 2015, and about 180 people, I think, were injured. It's one of those situations where it was a packed nightclub, they didn't have proper fire exits, and something on stage caught on fire, and just a big tragedy. It was huge news in Romania. And
we should say too, I almost feel like we should give a trigger warning on it. There is footage of the fire.
There is, and
it's a harrowing thing to see. I mean, you basically see the panic, and it doesn't go on for super long, but I mean, we basically see the fire start, and we see people.
You see, it's like a metal panicking. Band is playing, and they finish their song, and then the camera kind of pulls back, and you realize something is wrong, and people start to panic and run, and it's very intense footage. So what happened was a lot of people were injured, a couple dozen people died, but then a lot more people died in the hospital afterwards. Mm-hmm. And so this sports magazine, they start investigating why that happened. And so they uncover that there's this sort of corrupt pharmaceutical company that's selling disinfectants to hospitals that is ineffective. It doesn't work.
It's like watered down, massively watered down.
Yeah, and so watered down, it doesn't work, and people are dying of infections unnecessarily. And so that opens, I mean, this movie, it really is a Pandora's box, where it opens to where it exposes this massive corruption in the healthcare system of all things, which is just such a craven thing, to install a guy who runs a waste management company who doesn't really know what he's doing is one thing, but a guy running a hospital who got the job through political connections is just disgusting. And and it starts this sort of political, upheaval in Romania. And from there, the film kind of shifts, and we start following the interim health minister, who's a former patient advocate, who is trying to reform this system. And there's also a lot of very frustrating, not phone calls, but like meetings in this movie where they're sitting around a table saying, well, why can't we why can't we fire all the unqualified hospital managers? Why can't we do that? And people are like, well, you just can't. And it kind of goes into this, I just found it an extremely compelling narrative about, and you didn't talk about timeliness. The events in this film started about 5 years ago, but just the idea of watching government negligence and corruption and indifference causing unnecessary death is something that I think Americans very acutely feel right now.
Yeah.
And so watching that in this documentary was this documentary left my jaw on the floor.
Yeah, you're right that there is a lot of resonance to this during the year of COVID, and just the degree to which corruption and negligence cause death and exacerbate a medical crisis in
completely
some
unnecessary. People dying when they don't have to.
Yep. I thought a little bit of All the President's Men watching it, because it's definitely it's like a nonfiction version of that, in the sense that it is very much about pulling on a journalistic thread and realizing how far back something goes.
Yep.
In a lot of respects, I think about that great shot in All the President's Men where they're sitting at the table and the camera just keeps pulling back, and it just conveys the full scope of this thing, and this is very much about that as well. I also I think it's very much of a piece with a lot of films from Romania, the ones that have come over to the States. I mean, the Romanian New Wave was big last decade. Sorry, not last decade, but the previous one, with movies like 4 Months, 3 Weeks and 2 Days, and The Death of Mr. Lazarescu sort of opened up this.
This is basically a documentary version of The Death of Mr. Lazarescu in a lot of ways.
It very much is. It very much is about a broken healthcare system, and a lot of Romanian cinema, at least the films that we get over here, are about the failures of contemporary Romanian culture, and this feels like kind of a nonfiction companion piece to that.
That one is available. You can rent it on YouTube now. It came out at the end of November officially, so it's still a little more. It's $6.99 to rent on YouTube, but it's very much worth it. I was really just fascinated by this documentary.
Okay, so let's move on to my number 5 of the year, and that is a film called 14. And I had a little bit of minor trepidation about listing this film at all, because it's written and directed by a filmmaker named Dan Salit, and Dan is also a film critic, and that's kind of his day job, I guess you'd say, and he knows a lot of people in the business, and I actually met him finally last year. I mean, I know a lot of people who write for the AV Club have met him. In fact, this film features a short wordless cameo by Vadim Rizov, who has written for the site many times over the last few years. So obviously we put a disclaimer on the review and try to be transparent about that. I've only met him once, and it was a social situation where I was at the Vancouver Film Festival, and he was there with this film. And I think I honestly kind of went into it with a little bit of healthy skepticism about the acclaim I had been hearing about it. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was like, well, if you have friends in like, we all want each other to succeed, and Dan is like, by reputation, Dan is an enormously nice man, and I think for a lot of people, for me, it was just like, do people just want to see this thing succeed? But I met him once, and having seen the film, I think this is a legit, very strong film, and I almost resent that I've met him in some respects, because I have to give this disclaimer, because I think this thing stands very much on its own 2 feet. It is a drama about 2 women who have been friends since childhood, and it's about the way that that relationship evolves over the years. And the film probably unfolds about, I would say, probably roughly a decade in their lives. He never entirely reveals how long it is, but it's a very precise relationship that we come to understand between these 2 women, where one of them is kind of a perennial fuck up in some respects. She's always having these personal and professional crises, and the other friend sort of swoops in to help her pick up the pieces, one could say. And she's kind of she comes across as a little bit more of a doormat in their friendship, and Salit shows us ways over the course of the film that her constantly tending to the needs of this sort of serial monogamist in her life, how that does damage to her own personal life. But the film ends up unfolding over a few years, and we just see the way that the relationship slowly starts to change and the way that the two grow apart. And there have been movies like that before, but I'm not sure I've ever seen one that is so smart about how incremental that can be, and also about how rapid it can be. And the movie has this structure where there's no real signposting that of when we're jumping into the next era. He just kind of a new scene will start, and he'll let us catch up to the fact that it's now a year or two later, and we're now at a different point in these characters' lives. And he sort of uses the details around them and the change in their relationship to express the way that time has passed. In that respect, I think it is kind of in conversation with time as well. Only this one unfolds in a completely linear fashion.
Yeah.
In any case, you can take it with a grain of salt, because he is a film critic. But this is just a lovely and often funny film, and a really beautifully acted one. The film has two tremendous lead performances. Tali Madell plays the kind of, I guess you could say, the mousier of the two friends, the one who at a certain point starts to realize that this is not a healthy friendship, and Norma Cooling plays the other friend, the one who sort of barrels through life like a bull in a china shop. They're both wonderful performances from both of them. It's a small film, but one that has really lingered for me over the year. And you can watch this film. You can rent it through Apple, and it's also. But if you don't want to give money to Apple, you'd rather support it. The film's small and vital distributor, which is Grasshopper Film. You can go to their website, and you can rent it through. You can rent it through the virtual cinema program there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Those are great because you're supporting the distributor and an indie theater at the same time.
Yeah, we should say that when you can support virtual cinema, it's great. I mean, I will say that obviously it tends to be a little bit pricier, only in the respect that you basically are paying what you would pay for a movie ticket.
Yeah, that's the thing, though. It's what you'd pay to go to a movie. Exactly.
So, and you can... I mean, they're all sort of, basically you can choose your theater. So if you want to support your local theater or something, you can basically choose where the money goes to. So you're watching it. So though they're all kind of going through the same platform, you're basically, if you were, say you live in Chicago, you would go to the site and you would say, well, I want to watch it through the Gene Siskel Film Center. And
right.
A portion of the money would go to the film center. So it helps the distributor. It helps the theater. Theaters are going to need some help in the months to come because we don't really know what's coming, especially for smaller theaters. I know that AMC, one of the big chains, is in a lot of trouble as well. But
yeah, I mean, I get more fired up about the the smaller theaters.
Well, of course. Of course.
All right.
So my number 4 film of the year is First Cow, which we already talked about. So let's talk about your number 4 film of the year.
My number 4 film of the year is The Assistant, which is by Kitty Green. It is. It's been voted in some circles as a debut film, which is only true if documentaries don't count. She also did a documentary.
And they do.
I think they do. She also did a film called Casting John Bonet, which also blurred some lines between documentary and fiction, which I enjoyed very much, actually. I was very pleased to connect those dots. This film is wholly fiction, however. So it's another day in the life film. It's a day in the life of an assistant at a film distributor, producer, production company in New York that is some of the details in the film. I reported quite a bit on the Harvey Weinstein story when it broke, and a lot of the details in the film are taken directly from that particular case and the evidence in that case. So she works for a media mogul who is, sort of a veiled version of Harvey Weinstein, the abusive, sexually predatory boss. But the thing is this is another film where the clues are subtle. She's the first one in the morning. She shows up before dawn to turn on the lights and, start making the coffee and everything. And she notices an earring laying on the floor in her boss's office. and there's a stain on the couch, and there's a scene where we watch her scrub the stain out of the couch. And little subtle clues like that just build and build and build throughout the film, to the extent to where it becomes obvious that the culture of misogyny at this company is deeply woven into it. And men, women who work there are all kind of consider these women that the boss preys on as, they see them as kind of throwaway people who aren't very important. And so the main character, she's played by Julia Garner, by the way. She is young enough and has only been at this company for, I think they say, 5 weeks. And so she still has a conscience. And so she takes she goes to HR to try to say, I think something is very wrong here. And I won't say what happens after that, but I think this film is it's very powerful. Its message about complicity. And I think it also is very, it really realistically shows how these structures of power are created and maintained, and how things could be covered up for so long. You know, whenever there's a high profile sort of like sexual harassment or assault allegation, people are like, how could this go on so long and no one knew? This movie demonstrates that.
It's very much about a culture of looking the other way, and about complicity. And I think it's one of the movie's boldest choices is that the Harvey Weinstein character, we never see him. He never appears on screen. They never use his name even. He's just him. That's just
it's
how
not
they
about
refer
him,
to him.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Because ultimately the film, I mean, he becomes this big structural absence in the film, and obviously I think the fact that he's not on screen really strengthens the idea that he could be Harvey Weinstein. But you're right also that it's definitely the film is not about Weinstein's transgressions and his crimes. Right. It's more about the whole network of enablers that existed around him that allowed this to happen. So the film becomes this procedural about a toxic workplace, but also about a whole industry, about Hollywood, I think, in general, and the way that Hollywood operates, and the way that what Weinstein did and people like Weinstein have done for many, many years, how it was condoned because there was money to make, because people did not want to hurt their own careers. And I think one of the most radical things about the film, and one of the reasons this by the way is my number 2 film of the year. Spoiler: I almost called this my favorite of the year because I think it's such a radical, like a smart, daring experiment. But I think one of the things that makes it so powerful is that the film kind of puts you on this character's side. Her name is Jane, and we understand that she's kind of she's on the low end of the totem pole. She has a shitty job. I mean, this movie, I think anyone who's ever worked a shitty corporate job will relate to this character, because it is whatever, even beyond the stuff specifically about the industry or about Weinstein. I think this is a very smart portrait of what it's like to work in a
toxic environment.
To work in a toxic environment and work in a hostile workspace. So the movie puts us on her side immediately. We can see ourselves in her maybe, and we don't want to see what happens to her happen. But at the same time, the movie does not completely let her character off the hook. Because the whole film is about complicity, it suggests that her role in this, that she plays a role in this too, that she understands what's at stake for her own career if she does blow the whistle. And it becomes about, I think, a little bit about that mortal struggle with her. To what extent does she need to speak about this thing versus keep quiet to help her own career?
Yeah, and it speaks a lot to, like you said, the larger culture, to where for a long time it was like, well, when you enter the film industry, this is just how it is, and you got to toughen up and get used to it.
Yep. And the whole thing's just this Spartan procedural too. It really is just like set over the course of one day, and a lot of it we're just sort of watching her go about her business. It's not structured in an overtly, one might say, a conventionally dramatic way, but its sort of power accumulates as evidence of what's going on accumulates.
Yeah, it's like a snowstorm, right? It starts with a few flakes, but by the end, these big snowbanks have piled up, and no one can ignore it, but a lot of people do, you know?
Yep.
And I thought that Julia Garner's performance in this movie was very good also. She has this look on her face throughout most of the film where her eyes look very tired and her jaw is kind of set and she's got her lips kind of pursed, and it's just this look of like grim determination that she has throughout the film that I thought was conveyed a lot about the position her character was in.
Yeah, and I think it's a tricky role, honestly, because the movie is not interested much in her personal life or anything. This is not a film that's
she doesn't have one.
Right, she doesn't have one. Right, she's there like nights and weekends, basically. So the film is asking us basically to identify with a character who basically is defined, at least in the course of the film, by her work and by her dawning realization of what's going on and her sort of ethical struggle with it. And I think it was really smart to cast an actor who can sort of who can be gripping even as she remains something of, I don't want to say a cipher, but definitely somebody who we don't learn a ton about. Mm-hmm. And she is sort of standing in for a lot of people in this industry. There's one scene in this movie too that I don't hear discussed a lot that I think is it's a really small scene, but I think it speaks volumes, so to speak. And Patrick Wilson shows up. She's in the elevator, and Patrick Wilson shows up, and he's in the elevator with her. And that's really all the scene is. It's just they go to the top floor, and I think that sticking a Hollywood actor in there and giving him no lines of dialogue, making him silent, I think is making a very Kitty Green, the director, is making a point about the degree to which Weinstein was able to keep operating, also because there were a number of famous people who said nothing.
Yep.
The Assistant is available to watch on Hulu, right? Currently. Mm-hmm. If you do not have Hulu, you can also rent it at all the digital platforms.
Awesome. So, Dad, your number 4 we've already talked about, which is First Cow. So what about your number 3?
Okay, my number 3 film of the year is a comedy called The Climb. Now, this is a movie that premiered at Cannes last year and then played again at Sundance this year. Also, I think also Toronto the year before. Sort of did the festival rounds. And it's a kind of remarkably prickly and ambitious American comedy. And for a first feature, enormously confident, too. I think that doing this job, we kind of get used to seeing a lot of small American indies. And a lot of them have the kind of same... A very similar vocabulary, one might say, a visual vocabulary. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of... sometimes there's not a lot of thought put into things like composition or I feel like I'm dogging a lot of movies. I'm sort of insulting a lot of films, but I say that we have sort of seen a lot of small independent American comedies that don't have a great interest in form as much as they do in content and dialogue. And
well, I would say a lot of studio American comedies. It's only in the past couple years that they've rediscovered editing, so I'll say that much.
You're right. I mean, it's not exclusive to the independent films. I think American comedy in general, over the last couple decades, has not been known for being necessarily really formally inventive. Mm-hmm. But this is a film that announces that it is going to make the camera a co-conspirator in its fun from the opening scene. The opening scene, which is it's an extension of a short that these two filmmakers made. The sort of short, the short version of the feature, also called The Climb. And two best friends are biking in France. And it's a single long take, and over the course of the take, one of the friends reveals to the other one that he's been sleeping with his fiance, and their friendship just kind of implodes from there. Obviously, and the opening sequence is 9 minutes. It's one single shot, and it sort of prepares you for the fact this is a film that's going to be, maybe a little show-offy in moments, but also one that is genuinely interested in using the form of. Using form to aid in its comedy and its drama, and it actually is. There's a lot of parallels between this and 14 because it's another film about this relationship and how it changes over the years, and it's a kind of, in its own way, it's a very toxic relationship, but the movie never takes the course you necessarily expect it to take. The mixture, the comedy in this, I think, is, if not one of a kind, it's definitely very singular, because the movie, without ever quite, I wouldn't argue that this is a comedy drama, but I would say that it has a very prickly conception of its characters. We talked earlier about unpredictability when we were talking about Beanpole, which is another film about a complicated relationship. I guess that's kind of that's one of my interests, I suppose, one of my dramatic interests. But
14 also.
Yeah, that's pretty unpredictable too. And I think that this is a movie where I did not have a sense exactly where this complicated and unhealthy relationship was going, but the movie kept surprising me. With it's sort of organized. Even structurally, it's a little different than your average comedy. It's sort of organized in vignettes. So every scene like most of the movie unfolds in single scenes that take place, sometimes months, sometimes years apart. After that opening scene, which is, obviously the scene where they're biking up this hill, they're on this bike ride, the movie jumps ahead immediately to a funeral. So already we're like, we understand that these characters' lives have changed enormously in the space between the cut, sort of. So I don't know. I mean, I thought this was. I don't think we don't see a lot of American comedies with this much ambition, and I was really blown away by it as a first feature as well. The director, his name is Michael Angelo Cavino. He has a small role in News of the World, the new Tom Hanks movie that's opening this Christmas. He directed the film. He stars as the shitty friend, and he co-wrote the film with his co-star Kyle Marvin. So they're real life friends, and that chemistry I think informs some of what we see in this movie.
And this is one that people are going to have to wait a little bit longer to see, right?
So yeah, you'll have to wait until January 19th to see it, to watch it at home. Strangely enough, Sony Classics, who the distributor of the film, decided that it definitely needed to be in theaters. I will say it is a good-looking film, and it looks good on the big screen, but I wouldn't encourage anyone necessarily to risk their lives to see this movie.
Yeah, we're just kind of having a general policy of you don't really need to go to a movie theater.
No, and we try to put we've talked about this before on the show too. We put disclaimers at the top of reviews of anything that's opening in theaters, like maybe think about this before doing it. I don't know, but this. I hope people catch up with this film. I actually think it's one of the more slept on great films of the year.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, my number 3 pick is one that, was less slept on, but I think it's one of my more idiosyncratic picks for the year, I think, especially how high I ranked it, which is Shirley, starring Elizabeth Moss. This is a great year one's not a great year for Elizabeth Moss, let's be honest, but she had a great year this year with starring turns in The Invisible Man and also in this film, and I thought her performance in this film was fabulous. This is one that just really... So it's my favorite type of biopic, which is a biopic that focuses on a specific period in someone's life. And it is about the horror writer Shirley Jackson, who's having something of a renaissance right now. And partially because of this film. And so it takes elements of her real life and kind of things that were happening in her life at different times in her life and condenses them into this mostly true biographical film about so Moss plays Shirley Jackson, and then Michael Stuhlbarg plays her husband, Stanley Hyman. And they have a kind of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf thing going on where they get drunk and scream at each other all the time. And so into this steps a young couple played by Odessa Young and Logan Lerman. And Logan Lerman is trying to become a professor at the college where his name is Fred, and he is trying to get a position at the college where Stanley Hyman, Jackson's husband, works. And so they come and move in with them, thinking that this is going to be a mentorship situation, but they basically become the hired help, the unpaid hired help at their house. But what I really liked about this film was that it first of all, the character of Shirley, she is a mean, difficult person who is honestly very hard to live with, but she also, she suffers from severe depression and has trouble getting out of bed. And so I thought this film captured the chaos of creation and sometimes how creation can be very messy. It's not you sit down at a table and have a wonderful idea and then sit and write your book. It doesn't work like that. Surely in the film she has these like little visions where little bits and pieces of the book are coming to her. And it also, the thing that I really liked about it captured something that I really identified with, which was this sort of death drive that sometimes you see in, like, it's this sort of push and pull. In the film's 1950s setting, it was a time when I imagine that this was really prevalent. You sort of have this push and pull between, like, what you're told is like your role as a woman, you know, being a wife and a mother, and then, you know, like your desire to like be creative in other areas, and the sort of friction between that can create this really kind of dark death drive that I think this film really captures very well.
Now, did you come up on this film? Because I feel like, so we've talked about this film a little bit before. We talked about it earlier in the year on the podcast, and I feel like you gave it a positive review for the site, but I didn't necessarily get the impression at the time that it was that it was even in contention for being one of your favorite movies of the year. Am I wrong about that, or have you?
No, I watched it again and I came up on it. I was like, I watched it again and
that happens, folks. You have to understand is that like people get really hung up on the grades that we give movies. And
I wish they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that we sometimes we're shooting from the hip, and I'm of the opinion that one's first impression on a film is rarely the final one. That the more you watch something, the more particularly a really good film, your attitude about it might change over the years and over multiple rewatches. So this one definitely came up for you.
Yeah, I came up on this one quite a bit. I mean, I think that it's Moss's performance that really sealed it shooting up so far in my rankings, but also just its really distinctive point of view on the creative process is one that I found really invigorating and relatable, really.
Yeah, Moss is really a force of nature, you know. I think in terms of working actors today, it's hard to think of many who are just so constantly exciting, you know.
Right, exactly. Who you know is going to be good no matter what.
Yeah,
even if the movie's really not that good, she's going to be good.
I like that. Yeah, that's the thing. She can sink her teeth into even a minor role. You know, I think about something like she has a small comic supporting turn in the movie The Square, playing this American journalist that's very funny. And she has this small kind of thankless role in this movie called Chuck, which it stars Liev Schreiber as the boxer who Rocky was supposedly based on, and she plays his long-suffering first wife in that. And she has one scene where you're just like, that she just knocks out of the park, and you're like, can I follow this character instead? You know?
She's really good at playing women on the verge, you know, on the verge of something.
Usually these last few years.
Yeah.
You know? I thought that hers was, I thought that she should have been in contention for Best Actress last year for her smell. And as you mentioned before, she gives two really strong performances this year as well.
Yep.
Okay, so my Shirley you can see on Hulu right now. It is because it was released by Neon. It is one of the many films that have that has made its way to Hulu. That particular distributor has a relationship with Hulu, so you can catch that on Hulu right now. My number 2 film of the year we already discussed. That was The Assistant. So let's talk about your number 2 film of the year.
My number 2 film of the year was Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. This is another film where the director is Eliza Hittman, and she had made a few films before that had some similarities to this one. She's developing, one could say, sort of an auteur style. But I thought that this film was just a gigantic leap forward for her.
Agreed.
Yeah. She kind of specializes also in slow-paced, subtle dramas, and more of a sort of coming of age. Her movies tend to focus on young people. And she did one previously called Beach Rats that was kind of slow and quiet to a fault.
I agree.
But this one, I think it's the sort of subtle quietness of the film actually is very powerful, and perhaps it's just the story. It fits the story better. But I would argue that it is, sort of a leap forward in her directing style as well. So this film, it concentrates on 2 girls, cousins in rural Pennsylvania. One of them is pregnant, and she knows for a fact that she does not want to become a mother. She goes to a clinic in their town, but it's one of those Christian clinics where they say that they're going to, offer you options, but the option they give you to is Jesus Christ. And so she, her and her cousin end up kind of lifting some money from the register at the grocery store where they work and setting off to New York, for an appointment at Planned Parenthood. And they end up having to stay 2 days before she can get an abortion. And it's just sort of the story about these two girls. Because the thing is that, like, abortion, it's a very private thing that not a lot of people will talk about. A lot of people have had one, but they don't really talk about it. And I think that this film sort of captures the sort of interesting in-between place that we are in America right now, where depending on what county you live in, either you can, exercise your full reproductive rights, with very little blowback and a low cost, or you're just screwed. You've got to get on a bus and go somewhere else. And so I think that this film captured that quite a bit, and I thought the lead performance is very, very... There's an extremely affecting scene in the middle of this film where Sydney Flanagan, she plays the girl who is... she's pregnant. And there's a scene in the film that just really is a knockout, I think, where it's describing the title of the film, where she finally gets to the office and they end up staying on the subway all night. This is another film that could have gone in a very trauma porn kind of direction, but it doesn't, and I admire it for that. Two girls overnight in New York who are kind of teenagers and naive. Some bad stuff could happen to them, right? But they make it through. And so she finally makes it to the office, and she sits down with a nurse, and they tell her to answer a series of questions with never, rarely, sometimes, or always. And through this series of questions, we learn everything about how this girl got to this point and why she's there, and just like everything that she's keeping inside. And I think the quietness of this film does speak to the sort of the cloud of shame and the baggage. They drag a suitcase behind them the whole time they're in New York, which is sort of this visual symbol of the baggage of what they're doing. And it's the silence surrounding abortion, I think, is reflected in the quietness of the film.
Yeah, I do think that the quietness it feels a little bit to me, much more so in her earlier films, but maybe a little bit in this one, can feel a little bit like an affectation to me at times. I think that Hittman was guilty, particularly in her earlier films, of kind of buying into this certain art house style where none of the characters ever talk much, It's all just like... as if like too much dialogue might somehow disrupt the mood of sort of observational purity or something. And there were moments watching this where I was like, did these two really take a bus ride all the way to New York and not have a single conversation on the way? But it is the scene you're talking about in particular is so powerful. And I do think that this is really a really strong observational portrait of the hoops that women have to jump through in this country, particularly in some parts of this country, to terminate a pregnancy. And Carolyn Seed, who wrote the capsule for this film on our top 25 list, noted that it says something very strong about America, that we now have a whole subgenre of films that are about taking a road trip to get an abortion.
Absolutely. Absolutely it does. And as far as the quietness, I think that maybe where the step up here is that I think that Hittman shows the closeness between Sydney Flanagan. She's like I said, the girl who is pregnant. Her name is Autumn, and her cousin Skylar is played by Talia Ryder. There's a lot of subtle looks between them, and if something is happening that is maybe a little bit scary, they'll kind of reach out for each other's hands and things like that. And I found that closeness very touching. It
is very touching. There's also a great scene in the second half of the film where the two of them have a fight, and then it's resolved in a way that just feels so perfectly observed and so perfectly realistic in terms of the way that these two characters, these two teenage girls, might resolve it, not with a big speech. In some respects, Hittman's allergy to too much dialogue is actually a real a real benefit, because I think there are moments where she can speak volumes about these characters and about their situation without having everyone just blather it all out. And the way that the two of them reconcile felt very real to me. A lot of her. I think a lot of this film feels intensely real, and I think it's also a pretty charming is the wrong word. There's nothing necessarily charming about this film, but there is something kind of
endearing, maybe.
Endearing might be the right word. I think you're right. There is something endearing about this film as a portrait of essentially two like country mice in the big city, because it's obviously not the main thrust of the film, but there is a lot of stuff in this movie that's about two kids basically in New York City, and they're killing time in New York City, and it's not like the most fun trip because they don't have much money, and obviously they've come there to do something very serious, but they still are kind of starry-eyed kids in New York. So it becomes a kind of stealth portrait of New York through the eyes of outsiders as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So never, rarely, sometimes, always, and trust me when I say this, the name, I think people struggle with the name until they get to the scene where it's revealed what the name is, and then I think it becomes a lot easier to remember that full title once you know its significance. But Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always is streaming now on HBO Max. You can also purchase it anyway through the digital platforms. We have reached the end of our top 10, and we are going to talk about a couple of films. Yeah, we've made it.
Yep. Thanks for sticking with us, everybody.
Yeah,
you got a bonus-size episode this week.
That's right. And both of our number ones were on each other's respective lists. They were just in different places. So why don't we start with yours, Katie? What is your number one film of the year?
My number one film of the year was Nomadland, which I thought really it combined a lot of the things that we've talked about. The sort of like sensitive observation and the sort of depiction of people living on the margins of society without turning it into like a joyless slog. I think it does that really beautifully, and I also think that the way that this film is shot was absolutely gorgeous. And there is some element of blending documentary and fiction in this film because it is based on a nonfiction book. And so the story is Frances McDormand optioned the book and brought it to Chloe Zhao, the writer and director, who she did a very well-received film called The Writer previous to this. And so Chloe Zhao kind of specializes in romantic portraits of the American West, basically, through these sort of smaller, intimate stories about, people, character studies. And so this one is about people who mostly due to economic circumstances, they've kind of been left behind by society. They're older people. They were raised and told that they would be able to retire and Social Security and all this, but the safety net has fallen apart, and these people are falling through the cracks. And so what they do is they travel around in vans that are kind of retrofitted to live in and go from seasonal job to seasonal job. And the film follows a year in the life of one of these characters, Fern, who is played by McDormand, and goes from in the winter she works at Amazon, and in the summer she works at a campground, and kind of travels around like that. And we see the characters that come and go in her life, and some of them are actors. David Strathern plays a supporting role in the film as her sort of love interest. It's very subtle. But also some of the characters are real life nomads. And that is where I wanted to come back around. You were talking about with Vitalina Varela, where it sort of inspects the landscape of her face. You see that quite a bit in Nomadland.
Oh, for sure. 100%. Yeah. I think that that Zhao's approach in that she casts people as themselves, which is something she did in The Writer as well, really lends this not just an authenticity to her films, but also a different kind of flavor than you normally get from dramas about a lot of dramas. I feel like about a lot of American dramas about the outskirts of American culture end up feeling a little like tourism to me. Like a filmmaker who's just kind of come in to soak up this exploit might be a strong word, because I often don't necessarily feel that that's what they're always trying to do, but they're dropping into this environment and trying to get a story out of it. essentially.
Right.
And I think that Zhao's process of involving the kind of people who she's making a movie about and having them play themselves, I think that what it does is that it ends up making the film feel less like tourism and more like we're actually genuinely spending time in this environment. And you've mentioned this before, that the way the movie was shot was they really spent time with these nomads, and the crew lived with them, and they did go around the country in that way. And I think that informs so much of the feeling of this film and so much of its sense of genuine authenticity.
Yeah, and I think that involving the people in their own stories also lends those stories an aura of dignity and respect. I think Zhao has a lot of respect for the people she puts into her films, and considering they're people on the margins of society, that is, they deserve respect, same as anybody else. And when you combine it with the cinematography in this film is beautiful. It's very luminous. A lot of beautiful nature photography, a lot of sunrises and sunsets. And there's one gorgeous shot where it's just McDormand walking across a field, and she's got a lantern in one hand, and the glow of the lantern against the glow of the sunset. That's just gorgeous. And I think that combining that really beautiful cinematography with these kind of, I guess, humble milieus elevates those people and their lives to the status of myth almost.
Yeah, I agree. And I think actually this movie would make a lovely double feature with First Cow. Because I think they are both really about the character of America and about the way that that the American economy abandons people. But neither of them play like pity parties. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you were talking about that dignity, but it also has to do with just wanting to explore these people's lives and not see them purely as victims. And in Nomadland, it's not always clear how many of the people we're following have made this lifestyle choice out of necessity or out of a genuine desire to live this way. And I think it's as a character drama, I think it's really interesting the way that the film gradually reveals that McDormand's character is somebody who, well, she might have been pushed into these circumstances by economic desperation, finds a kinship with this way of life, and one that suggests something about her character that goes far beyond just this person is broke and has to live this way.
Yeah, and I would think the larger American character too. I think this film conveys something about working people, which is that often they don't want to take charity. That's something that's very American as well, being like, no, I'm fine, I got it.
There's a scene later in the film where she comes in, she comes to stay with some family, and her family is basically like, what are you doing? Like, just you can live with us, you don't need to live this way. And she just kind of rejects that.
And it all ties in with the sort of like restless romanticism of the American West. It all ties together really beautifully, like the small scale and the big scale. I think that's a theme that's coming up a lot on this list here.
Yeah.
Films that can balance big themes and small stories, yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of one of the themes of the year, one might say.
So this is another one that you won't be able to watch until next year at home. It's not coming out until February 19th, 2021. It is having a small qualifying run in movie theaters, but again, we're not super keen on recommending that you go to a movie theater right now.
Don't encourage that until you have the vaccine.
Yes.
Though I will say that this is a much more justifiable reason to go to the theater than Tenet, in my opinion. But
well, yeah, Tenet. It wasn't on either of our lists, is all we should say about that.
But, maybe don't go to the theater. Just see, you will get a chance to see it in February. I know it'll be hard to wait that long because this is a marvelous film, but it'll be out there.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens because Chloe Zhao, this film's very celebrated, won awards at Venice and Toronto, and her next project is she's making a big Marvel movie, so knock on wood, she can maintain her distinctive style despite all that.
Hope she doesn't get ground up in the gears of the Marvel industrial complex.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Okay, so my number one film of the year. And I'm going to preface this by saying that I actually kind of feel I feel a little guilty for picking a film that was not directed by a woman in this year with
Oh.
so many great films directed by women. But I have to be true to my heart on this one. And my choice for film of the year is Charlie Kaufman's I'm Thinking of Ending Things.
Yeah, I like this one too. We talked about this one on the podcast.
We did. So we've talked plenty about this film. Maybe I won't say too much about it. It kind of hit Netflix in the early fall, and Kaufman at this point is a filmmaker who I think he's a genuine one of a kind, and I think he's somebody who could not be boring or accessible if he tried, you know?
Can you imagine Charlie Kaufman getting sucked into the Marvel machine?
No,
I don't think that would last very long.
I don't think so either. I mean, I think he's done a little bit of work for hire work where he'll punch up a script here and there.
Okay.
But the thing about it is that, especially since Kaufman has started directing his own scripts, which he started doing with Synecdoche, New York, about 10 years ago at this point, I think he's moved even further away from what we would call mainstream concerns. Mm-hmm. There used to be this kind of ballast that would exist in the form of another filmmaker who might sort of bring into alignment some of his bigger, bolder ideas and make the thing a little bit more accessible. It's a weird thing to say about something as weird as being John Malkovich, but in retrospect, Malkovich is one of his most, I dare say, conventional movies, if you could ever think of that film as conventional.
Well, it's definitely a touchstone, I mean, among cinephiles of about our age, like people in their 30s, you know, people remember that film very, very fondly.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, it was up for Academy Awards, too. I mean, like Spike Jonze, the director, was up for Best Director. It's hard to imagine.
I had it on VHS.
Yeah. Great film. I mean, I'm not, again, with Kaufman, accessibility or mainstream are very relative distinctions.
Yeah.
He's always been somebody with an enormous imagination, but he's also been somebody who who has a great degree of existential despair that comes through in his work. So you get these movies that are both very high concept, but also have a kind of dim view on humanity and on maybe on the psychology of their own characters.
I would say that he has more of a dim view of the inside of one's own mind than he does a dim view of other people.
And I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I think, might be his most interior film yet. It starts out looking like it might be one of his more straightforward ones, actually. The movie begins with Jessie Buckley plays this young woman who is going to meet the parents of her boyfriend, played by Jesse Plemons. And by the way, I choose to believe that that he cast two actors, that he knew what he was doing when he cast two actors with the same first name. There's something going on there that reflects some of the stuff that's going on in this movie, maybe. But they basically go on this road trip. It's like a day trip to go meet his parents. And for a while, it seems like it might be his most straightforward film in some ways.
Yeah, just sort of a really prickly, dark, funny comedy about a relationship that is on its last legs, but they're moving forward. Like, the bond between them is not very strong, but they're kind of moving forward with these milestones in a relationship anyway.
Exactly. But then they get to the house, and Kaufman starts kind of shifting the reality under our feet. The film turns briefly into kind of I would almost describe it as sort of a grotesque sitcom, where it's about her sort of going through the gauntlet of meeting the parents. And Kaufman, I mean, for whatever his other talents are, he also has he's very strong at highlighting and kind of enhancing life's small humiliations.
Right.
And this is very much, at least for a while, a film about the gauntlet of social awkwardness that can be interacting with a significant other's parents.
And he takes it to such an extreme. There's a scene in the middle of the movie where they're having dinner together that, like, I was watching it and it's just like, this is like if you were at your boyfriend's parents' house on mushrooms and you were, like, freaking out and just having a really bad time.
It's like cringe comedy to the nth degree, you know?
Absolutely.
But the movie is not that easily pinned down. I mean, I think there's a lot more going on, and I think that as it begins to sort of go down the rabbit hole in the way that Kaufman's films often do, I think it becomes about so much else. It becomes about identity. It becomes about the way that we like to define ourselves versus how other people define us. It becomes about the way that the things that we read inform our our desires in finding somebody in our life. The movie has you could argue that on some level the movie has a twist ending. It comes straight from its source material, a short novel by Ian Reid that I read breathlessly in the days before I saw the film. And
yep.
I think one of the many remarkable things about this movie is that it preserves the ultimate, one might say the ultimate destination of this story while completely abstracting it. I can't say a whole lot more than that. But this movie, there is an explanation for some of the movie's slippery, shifting sense of reality. There is a tangible explanation for that, but Kaufman finds a way to both provide it and abstract it, and the movie truly goes off the deep end into sort of surreal expression in its last half an hour. I found it thrilling. I found the whole thing thrilling, honestly, and I think that in many respects, seeing a Charlie Kaufman film is like getting an invitation to spend some time in his mind, and it's an exciting place to visit. But I wouldn't want to live there.
Yeah, absolutely. I found this to be his most relatable film yet. I mean, you pointed that out last time, but it's also his first one with a female protagonist, so maybe that has something to do with it. But just the way, because like you said, it does get very abstract and goes in all these different directions, but I think it does maintain a sort of through line throughout successfully, which is a sort of push and pull between self-definition and how the outside world defines you. Okay, everybody, that's our last film club for the year, and that's Dowd's and my top 10 for the year. You can see our full top 15 as well as all of our other contributors' ballots if you kind of want to see how the sausage gets made. And you can see the official AV Club's top 25 best films of 2020 list on the site. And once you've read all that, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. We're off for the holidays, but we'll be back in January with brand new episodes. Thanks for listening, folks.
See you then.